Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe. My channel, the air left my lungs. So fast it felt like someone had driven a fist straight through my ribs. Morning light was pouring across the white marble island in our kitchen, turning the surface almost silver, and on top of it Daniel had fanned out a set of glossy printouts with the kind of neat, deliberate cruelty that only comes from rehearsal. My mother-in-law, Patricia Whitmore, stood beside him in a cream cashmere set with both hands braced on the counter, her wedding diamonds flashing under the cold pendant lights as if she'd come to witness an execution. Lauren, Daniel's sister, was perched on one of the leather bar stools with her phone face down but recording light, glowing against the steel trim. Charles Whitmore stood at the far end of the room, shoulders squared, jaw working, his reflection fractured in the dark glass of the patio doors. Daniel didn't even wait for me to reach the island before he shoved the papers closer and said, loud enough for every person in that room to hear, "Go ahead, Evelyn. Tell them why confidential board documents were sent from your email last night while we were at my promotion dinner. My name is Evelyn Claire Whitmore. I'm 37, and this is the story of how my husband left me out of a celebration that was built on my work, then used the next morning to try to erase me from his life, only to learn I'd been quietly preparing to erase his lies instead." I looked down at the papers without touching them. There were screenshots of emails, my name in the sender line, a subject line about executive compensation, an attachment labeled Q3_transition_notes.pdf, a timestamp from 8:14 p.m. The same time Daniel, his parents, his sister, his cousins, and half the family board had been clinking crystal glasses at Law Reserve to celebrate his promotion to Chief Operating Officer of Whitmore Hospitality Group. Without me, the detail that made it almost elegant was the place setting. Lauren had posted a photo from the private room the night before. Long walnut table, amber candles, gold-rimmed plates, Daniel at the center, smiling with that disciplined, public smile of his, one hand around a Bordeaux glass, and the other resting on the back of Patricia's chair. 12 family members, 3 executives, one empty spot nowhere in sight. No seat for me, no apology, no explanation. And now, less than 12 hours later, the whole family was in my kitchen to accuse me of sabotaging the man I had spent 8 years helping become important. "You're quiet now," Patricia said, her voice soft and poisonous. "That's new." I set my handbag on the counter with a careful, almost pleasant motion. I was just admiring the effort. Daniel's mouth tightened. He was still wearing the same navy suit pants from the night before, though he'd changed into a pale blue Oxford shirt rolled at the forearms. There was a faint red crescent on his collarbone where someone's lipstick had failed to come all the way off. He must have noticed my eyes land there because he folded his arms instantly. "This isn't a joke," he snapped. "My promotion could be suspended because of this leak." Charles spoke next, low and official. "There's more. The family office reviewed the joint accounts this morning. $180,000 was moved out overnight. Into my attorney's trust," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. Lauren blinked first. "You're what?" I reached into my handbag, took out a slim black leather folio, and set it on the marble with a sound so small it still managed to cut through the room. Nobody moved. Even Patricia's rings, stilled against the countertop. "My attorney's trust," I repeated evenly. "You were all clearly expecting that to be a surprise. I'm sorry to disappoint you before coffee." Daniel leaned forward, so sharply the bar stool behind him scraped the floor. "You hired a lawyer 3 weeks ago." His face changed in stages. Confusion first, then annoyance, then something colder. "Because of what?" I finally looked at him. Really looked at him. The restless fingers, the vein beating at his temple, the careful anger that had always worked so well on other people because they mistook it for certainty. "Because," I said, "you took your entire family out to celebrate a promotion I helped engineer, left me home alone without a word, and came back smelling like perfume that doesn't belong to me." Patricia straightened. "Evelyn, don't be vulgar." Vulgar would have been making a scene at Law Reserve. I slid one of the printed screenshots back toward Daniel with one finger. "This is just tedious." He gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "So this is your defense? Jealousy?" "No," I said calmly. "My defense is metadata." Lauren's hand jerked toward her phone. I opened the folio and took out my iPad. I didn't rush. That was the part that unsettled them first. Daniel was breathing too fast. Patricia was already preparing indignation like a woman reaching for a fur coat. Charles kept shifting his weight from one polished loafer to the other. But I unlocked the screen, entered my passcode, and turned the device toward them one measured step at a time. That email, I said, tapping the screenshot, came from an address I stopped using 11 months ago. I kept it active as a ghost account because Daniel insisted on linking it to old household logins. Last month, after I noticed several failed access attempts from inside this house, I had my tech consultant install archive forwarding and geolocation logging. Daniel's voice came out strained. Tech consultant? Yes. I scrolled down. At 8:14 p.m. last night, while you were all enjoying the sea bass and congratulating yourselves, somebody logged into that account from my home office desktop. Lauren swallowed. I rotated the screen. On it was a clean log sheet with timestamps, device ID, internal IP address, and a location pin sitting right on our property. Patricia looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Lauren. I let that breathe for a second. Then I tapped again. Here's the security feed from the upstairs hall at 8:09 p.m., Daniel entering my office. And here's 8:10. Lauren following him with my spare key. Lauren's face drained so quickly it was almost theatrical. That isn't. Don't, I said quietly, and she stopped. The clip played in silence. The angle was high and grain-free. Daniel glancing over his shoulder. Lauren clutching her phone. The office door opening. The two of them disappearing inside. Charles made a sound in the back of his throat, like gravel being ground under a tire. Daniel recovered first, or tried to. You put cameras in the hall without telling me. I put cameras in my hallway after discovering someone had been entering my locked office, I replied. You're welcome to argue about marital privacy later. Right now, I think evidence tampering deserves priority. Patricia's eyes sharpened. You're recording this conversation. Of course I am. She looked outraged, but there was fear under it now. Thin and metallic. Daniel jabbed a finger at the transfer figure on the statement. And the money! I nodded. Yes, the money. The $180,000 that left our joint account 6 hours after I discovered your mother's lawyer had prepared a post-separation occupancy agreement naming this house as exclusively yours. Nobody said a word. I took another document from the folio. Cream paper. Watermarked letterhead. Gold embossing from Holloway and Pike Family Council. Patricia actually reached for the counter to steady herself. I found this draft in the printer tray in your study on Tuesday, I said. It would have been a stronger surprise if Meredith Pike's assistant hadn't forgotten to shred the duplicate. Daniel's face went flat. He knew that name. He also knew exactly what that meant. Not rumor. Not suspicion. Not intuition. Documented intent. Charles turned his head slowly toward Patricia. You said that was precautionary. Patricia's voice cracked on the first word. It was... No, I said, still calm. It was preparatory. Daniel took a step toward me. You went through my mother's private legal documents. You tried to throw me out of my own home the morning after excluding me from a family celebration that was built on 3/4 of my unpaid strategic labor. Let's not get precious now. He opened his mouth again, but I lifted my hand and continued before he could regain momentum. And one more thing. I enlarged the attached file name from the alleged leak. Q3_transition_notes.pdf was not a confidential board document. It was a decoy file I created 46 days ago and labeled with a digital watermark unique to one recipient. Daniel stared at the screen. I met his eyes. You. The room seemed to contract around that one syllable. You gave me a fake file, he said. I gave you a test. Patricia's voice came out a whisper. Daniel! He said you were paranoid, Lauren blurted suddenly, then clamped her lips shut as if she could force the words back in. Daniel swung toward her so fast she recoiled on the stool. Be quiet. I watched the panic start to travel through them, fast and messy, like fire finding dry curtains. That file existed for one reason, I said. To tell me whether confidential material leaving this house would lead back to carelessness, incompetence, or intent. I'm so relieved to have an answer. Charles sank into one of the bar stools with both hands on his knees. The old authority in him looked dented for the first time since I'd known him. Daniel, he said, not loudly. Tell me this is salvageable. Daniel looked at his father, then at the screen, then at me. His voice dropped into the tone he used with hotel managers and bankers, and anyone he thought could still be bent. Evelyn, whatever you think this is, whatever story you've worked yourself into, we can handle it privately. I almost smiled. That was the first thing he'd said all morning that sounded honest. Privately, I repeated, like the apartment on Mercer Street. His expression froze. Patricia's head snapped toward him. What apartment? I tapped my screen again and brought up a wire transfer receipt, then a lease application, then a photo of Daniel standing outside a glass tower entrance in Tribeca with a woman in a camel coat and straight black hair, her hand resting on his forearm. I didn't say her name yet. I didn't need to. Patricia went pale under the kitchen lights. Lauren made a strangled sound. Charles closed his eyes briefly, like a man discovering the staircase beneath him had been built from paper. Daniel's voice was barely more than breath. You hired someone to follow me. No, I said. She came to me. That landed harder than everything else. Who? Patricia demanded. I locked the iPad and slipped it back into the folio. You'll find out soon enough. Then I picked up my handbag. Daniel moved around the island, trying to reassert something physical, some old domestic gravity, but I was already stepping back. You're not leaving in the middle of this. I'm leaving because this part is over. Evelyn. I looked directly at him. Don't call the police. Call your own lawyer. He actually flinched. I turned for the door, heels clicking across the limestone tile like a metronome, and the whole room seemed to split open behind me in whispers, half-finished accusations, Patricia demanding names, Lauren swearing she only did what Daniel asked, Charles saying, over and over, not in this house. Not like this. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the driveway, the morning had warmed just enough to take the edge off the air. The sycamores along the property line moved in a slow, silver ripple. My driver, Tomas, opened the rear door of the black sedan without a question because I had texted him 20 minutes earlier and simply written, "Be ready." I got in, set the folio beside me, and exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. They thought they had forged a scandal clean enough to bury me under it. They had no idea I'd spent 3 months building the floor beneath their feet. One document, one timestamp, one lie at a time. The next few days were noisier than I expected and uglier than I didn't. Daniel called 11 times before noon. I let the phone vibrate against the leather seat beside me until the screen went dark. Patricia left 2 voicemails in that clipped, charitable voice she used when threatening people while pretending to worry about them. Charles sent a single text, "We need to discuss this as a family." Lauren sent nothing, which told me more than any paragraph could have. By 2 in the afternoon, Daniel switched tactics. I was seated in a corner office on the 23rd floor of Sloane, Bauer and Kent, watching rain thread down the windows over lower Manhattan, when his first written message came through. "You've made your point. Come home and we'll straighten this out." 10 minutes later, "This doesn't need to become public." An hour after that, "You moved marital funds without consent. Don't force me to respond in kind." I forwarded each one to Julia Sloane without commentary. Julia was 61, silver-haired, exacting, and built like a woman who had spent her life winning arguments in rooms designed by men who assumed oak paneling could intimidate her. Her office smelled faintly of bergamot and paper. Everything in it had weight. The walnut desk, the cream wool carpet, the brass reading lamp, the sentence structure. She had a way of removing her glasses very slowly when she wanted someone to understand the magnitude of their mistake. She did that now after reading Daniel's last text. "He's still assuming you're negotiating emotionally," she said. "He usually gets away with that." Julia placed the phone on her desk. "Not anymore." Across from us sat Reed Sullivan, the forensic accountant she'd pulled in that morning. Reed had already built 3 binders from the material I'd been collecting: property transactions, family office transfers, internal expense reimbursements, and the quiet little maze Daniel had created through subsidiary vendors and event budgets to move money where he thought no one would look. He had a soft voice and devastating timing, a combination I had come to appreciate. "I finished tracing the Mercer Street apartment deposit," he said, sliding a tab page toward Julia. "It didn't come from Daniel's personal account. It was funneled through North Shore Events Consulting, which billed Whitmore Hospitality for executive retreat planning that never occurred." Julia looked at me. "And who authorized North Shore?" "Lauren," I said. "Daniel pushed it through her department because nobody ever questions family sign-off." Reed nodded once. We also matched 2 of the payments to the private car service used on the nights he met her. Her. I still hadn't said the name out loud in that room, though by then Julian knew it. Sienna Vale, Daniel's executive communications director. 32. Elegant in a controlled way. Always immaculate. The kind of woman Patricia pretended not to notice, because acknowledging her would have meant acknowledging why Daniel suddenly cared so much about internal media training. She was also the person who had first tipped the board inquiry before Daniel ever tried to weaponize it against me. Not because she cared about me then, because she had realized he was planning to feed her to the wolves if anything surfaced. The first time she contacted me was 7 weeks before the promotion dinner. Tuesday night, 10:43 p.m. An unknown number. Just a photo in 1 sentence. This is probably yours. The photo showed Daniel asleep in the back of a car with his phone in his hand and an email draft open on screen. The message was to Lauren. Subject line, after promotion, we move fast. The visible line beneath it said, she won't know what hit her. I remember staring at the image in the dark of our guest room, the charger light casting a thin blue bar across the dresser, and feeling not heartbreak exactly, but a cool, clarifying kind of emptiness. Like a lake freezing over in a single night. I hadn't answered immediately. The next morning, the sender texted again. He thinks he's smarter than everyone. He isn't. If you want proof, reply. I replied with 2 words. Who is this? She took an hour. Then another photo. Daniel in the mirror of a hotel bathroom adjusting his tie. Her hand visible at the bottom of the frame, holding a lipstick tube. In the corner, a room service tray with a receipt from the Halcyon Hotel. Sienna, someone who found out I'm disposable too. We met 4 days later in the conservatory lounge at the Pembroke on Madison. Brass trim, green velvet banquettes, rain ticking softly against the glass ceiling above us. She arrived in a camel coat with oversized black sunglasses and the rigid composure of someone performing self-respect, because it was all that kept her from breaking apart. When she sat down, she didn't order. She set her phone on the table between us and kept one hand wrapped around it like it might bolt. He told me you were separated in everything but paperwork, she said. I stirred my tea once. We weren't. She nodded. No surprise. No fake outrage. Just a tiny, bitter exhale through her nose. I figured. She gave me the shape of it first. How Daniel had started confiding in her 6 months earlier. How he complained about being managed at home. How he said I was brilliant but emotionally cold, then brilliant but unstable, then brilliant but vindictive. Men like Daniel never settle on one story. They choose whatever version makes their next betrayal sound reasonable. He said the promotion would change everything, she said. New title, new structure, new life. And where did you fit in? She looked at the rain beyond the glass. Depends which week you asked him. She had receipts, messages, photos, calendar invitations forwarded to a second email. Draft talking points he'd asked her to prepare for the promotion announcement, including a line about streamlining personal distractions to match executive responsibilities. That phrase sat in my chest for days afterward. Personal distractions. 8 years of marriage. My late nights helping him rehearse investor meetings. My network. My strategic notes. My positioning memos. My labor turned into clutter by a man who had never once arrived fully formed to anything. The reason she switched sides was embarrassingly simple. He got greedy. 3 weeks into whatever future he had promised her, Daniel started routing apartment payments through company funds and hinting that, if questions arose, Sienna's signature on the PR expense approvals would make her the easiest one to sacrifice. Then he asked her to help create a narrative about my instability in case the divorce turned contentious. He even dictated language for an incident list. My mood, my imagined drinking, my supposed obsession with his phone. That was the moment she understood the role she'd really been cast in. Not partner, not successor, not even favorite, shield. So she called me. I never became sentimental about Sienna. She had known he was married, and no amount of betrayal on her side erased that. But I also didn't waste energy pretending morality is only clear when pain belongs to someone else. She made a selfish choice. Then she corrected course when she realized what kind of machine she'd stepped into. That mattered. By the second meeting, she was bringing me copies of invoices. By the third, she handed over the voice memo. Daniel's voice, low and irritated, captured in the front seat of a parked car while she pretended to look for her earring in her purse. "If Evelyn gets difficult," he said, "Lauren can push the old account issue. We'll make it look like she leaked out of spite. Mother already spoke to Meredith. We can get her out before year-end." I listened to it twice in my office with the door locked. Then I forwarded it to a secure folder and booked my first appointment with Julia Sloan. Now, sitting in that office days later, I watched Julia arrange the pieces into something formal and lethal. "We don't need theatrics," she said. "We need sequence. Sequence always wins." She had legal pads covered in names and dates. September 3rd, Daniel begins using North Shore vendor account. September 21st, first apartment deposit. October 2nd, Sienna records conversation about false leak narrative. October 17th, occupancy draft created. November 4th, decoy file delivered. November 11th, promotion dinner scheduled without spouse. November 11th, 8:09 p.m., Daniel and Lauren enter your office. November 11th, 8:14 p.m., false email sent. Premeditation, laid out line by line, has a different kind of brutality than confrontation. It doesn't shout. It accumulates. Julia tapped the final date with her pen. "We call for a meeting Friday. Not a family discussion. Formal counsel present. We'll give them one opportunity to cooperate before we file. And if they refuse..." She put her glasses back on. "Then Daniel can celebrate his promotion from the lobby of the federal courthouse." Friday arrived under a pale, winter-clean sky. The conference room at Sloan, Bauer and Kent, was all controlled authority. Dark gleaming wood, leather chairs the color of espresso, floor-to-ceiling windows throwing white light across the polished table, a carafe of water that looked almost too clear to trust. There was a framed abstract painting on the far wall in muted slate and rust tones, expensive enough to signal seriousness and bland enough to offend no one. The air smelled faintly of cedar and copy paper. I got there early with Julia and Reed. At 9:57, Daniel walked in with Meredith Pike and a junior associate carrying 2 red-welled folders. Daniel wore a charcoal suit, white shirt, silver tie, every inch the executive image he'd spent a decade constructing. But the details told the truth. His shoulders were too high. His tie knot was slightly off-center. The stubble along his jaw had been shaved in haste, leaving one faint nick below his ear. He didn't look at me immediately. Patricia entered behind him in navy silk and pearls, rigid as lacquer. Charles came last from their side, slower than usual, a hand resting briefly on the doorframe before he crossed the threshold. Lauren was not with them. That interested Julia more than she showed. Meredith Pike shook hands with professional neutrality. She was a family attorney first and a moral being second, which meant she had already measured the danger and chosen courtesy as cover. "Miss Sloan! Meredith!" We all sat. Daniel finally looked at me. "Are you really doing this?" I folded my hands on the table. "You mean in daylight?" Patricia inhaled sharply. Meredith glanced at her once, the tiniest warning. Julia opened the meeting. No flourish. No preamble. "This is a settlement and disclosure conference regarding marital fraud, asset concealment, evidence fabrication, corporate misappropriation, and possible criminal exposure arising from coordinated conduct by Daniel Whitmore and other associated parties. We're here because my client prefers resolution to spectacle." Daniel gave a short, incredulous laugh. "That's absurd." Reed slid the first binder across the table. "Is it?" Julia said. The next hour changed the temperature of the room by degrees, so small they almost felt kind. Reed started with the money. North Shore Events Consulting had no employees, no event history, and no operational footprint beyond a registered mailbox in Stamford and an accountant who had already responded nervously to an information request. The vendor billed Whitmore Hospitality for leadership retreat planning, executive branding workshops, and crisis simulations that never took place. Each invoice had been approved through Lauren's department. The payment routing then moved to a property management account connected to the Mercer Street apartment lease. Daniel interrupted twice. Reed kept going. Then Julia moved to the office access logs. Hallway footage. Device ID. IP trace. Archive forwarding. Security timestamps. She placed each item on the table one by one, as if setting cutlery before a meal. Daniel's attorney leafed through them faster and faster, which only made the pages sound frantic. Patricia tried a different angle. "This is still a marriage. There are privacy concerns. Julia didn't even blink. There are fraud concerns. Charles shifted in his chair. Daniel told us the documents were leaked from her account. I looked at him for the first time that morning. Yes, I said. He told you that because the truth required more imagination. Daniel's jaw flexed. You set me up. No, I said. I made sure you'd find exactly what I wanted you to find. That was the moment the first crack became visible. Not in Daniel. In Patricia. Her eyes moved to him slowly, with the dawning calculation of a woman trying to decide whether protecting the family name still meant protecting her son. There's a second in certain rooms when loyalty stops being instinct and becomes math. I watched that happen to her in real time. Meredith cleared her throat. Even assuming all of this is accurate, it does not prove intent to defraud Mrs. Whitmore specifically. Julia nodded once. Then perhaps this will help. She opened a slim black folder and pushed a transcript across the table. Sienna's recording. Daniel saw the first line before anyone else did, and the color left his face so abruptly it looked as though someone had pulled a shade over him. Patricia reached for the page. Patricia's voice came thin. I was told it was precautionary because she had become unpredictable. I actually laughed then. Not loudly. Just once. Every head turned. Do you know what I find most insulting? I said. It isn't the affair. It isn't even the forged leak. It's how lazy you all became. You built your case against me with adjectives. Difficult. Unstable. Vindictive. Women are so often destroyed with language that men stop bothering to bring facts. Julia let the sentence sit. Then she nodded toward the door. That was when Sienna walked in. For one suspended beat, nobody in the room moved. She wore a dove-gray suit, hair pulled into a low knot, no visible jewelry except a watch with a black leather strap. Her posture was perfectly straight, but I could see the tension in her hands where they clasped a document folder against her thigh. Beside her was her attorney, Helen Cho, whose expression suggested she had no interest in anyone's family dynamics and every interest in limiting her client's exposure. Patricia's mouth parted. Charles leaned back as if distance alone might undo what he was seeing. Daniel spoke first, and his voice cracked clean through the middle. What is she doing here? Sienna looked at him with something far beyond bitterness. It was colder than that. Recognition, maybe. The kind that comes after illusion dies and leaves no body to bury. Correcting the record, she said. Patricia turned to her in disbelief. You! Sienna's gaze shifted. You trusted me when I was useful. Let's not romanticize it. Daniel recovered enough to stand. You have no idea what you're stepping into. Helen Cho placed 2 fingers lightly on his deposition transcript packet. Sit down, Mr. Whitmore. He sat. Sienna provided what Julia called corroboration and what Daniel later called betrayal, though the word felt too noble for what he meant. She authenticated the recordings, confirmed the apartment, identified the nights billed through company accounts, produced chat exports, calendar screenshots, and draft messaging Daniel had asked her to prepare for the period immediately after the promotion announcement, including internal language that would position his home life as a resolved distraction. The room grew smaller with every page. When Julia asked why she had come forward, Sienna answered without drama. Because he told me I was different, she said. Then he asked me to help lie about his wife. 2 weeks later, I found out he had already arranged for those same lies to protect himself if finance started asking questions. He wasn't choosing me. He was staging exits. Even Daniel didn't have a response ready for that. And then, because Julia understood timing the way surgeons understand anatomy, she turned to the final section. The timeline, dates, transfers, drafts, access logs, voice memos, lease payments, the fake leak, the occupancy agreement, the board packet decoy, the dinner without me, the morning ambush. A conspiracy sounds melodramatic until you reduce it to sequence. Then it becomes undeniable. Premeditation matters, Julia said. Not just morally, legally. This wasn't one bad decision under stress. This was a coordinated strategy over weeks involving marital deception, asset diversion, reputational manipulation, and electronic fabrication. Charles took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Suddenly he looked his age. Lauren knew, he said quietly. I said nothing. Meredith answered instead. Based on this record, yes. Patricia turned on Daniel then, all elegance stripped out of her voice. You involved your sister. Daniel fired back instantly. You involved Meredith. Meredith's expression changed by a fraction and somehow managed to feel lethal. Be very careful, Daniel. Charles slapped a palm flat against the table. The sound cracked through the room. Enough! Everybody stopped. He looked at his son first, then at Patricia, then at the binder spread open before us like a dissection. I asked you one question in that kitchen, he said, whether this was salvageable. You looked me in the eye and let me think she had done this to you. Daniel didn't answer. It was almost impressive, the stubbornness, the refusal to surrender even when truth was on the table in index tabs. Julia took the opportunity to make the choice plain. My client is prepared to proceed in one of two directions. Option 1, immediate negotiated resolution. Daniel Whitmore resigns from the COO role pending internal review, waives any claim to the marital residence, repays diverted funds, consents to full forensic accounting, and executes a divorce settlement on terms already drafted. Patricia and Charles Whitmore agree not to interfere, directly or indirectly, with asset recovery or reputational remediation. Lauren Whitmore cooperates with investigators. Option 2, we file by close of business. Civil claims, corporate disclosure, referral package. Meredith looked at the settlement draft Julia slid across. Patricia went very still. Public filing would damage the company. Julia gave her a long look. Then you understand the incentive. Daniel's laugh this time sounded frayed. This is extortion. No, Julia said. This is consequences arriving on schedule. He turned to me at last, abandoning counsel, abandoning posture, abandoning strategy. You wanted to humiliate me. I held his gaze for a moment, and for the first time that day I let him see the truth of it. I wanted you to see them, I said quietly. All the things you thought would stay hidden because you assumed I'd be too embarrassed to pull them into daylight. His eyes flicked to Sienna, then to his parents, then to the pages, then back to me. He looked smaller sitting down than he ever had standing up. The fractures came quickly after that. Patricia wanted Lauren called immediately. Charles refused and demanded separate representation. Meredith requested a private caucus with the Whitmores. Daniel asked, absurdly, whether Sienna had copied company communications off-site. Helen Cho informed him that worrying about her exposure before his own was strategically unserious. For 10 minutes the room dissolved into overlapping blame, whispers, chair legs scraping hardwood, legal jargon used as bandages on a severed artery. I sat there with a glass of water untouched in front of me and watched the family that had spent years teaching everyone else how power looked collapse into the kind of panic they used to mock in weaker people. When they returned from caucus, the decision had already been made. Meredith spoke because Daniel clearly couldn't trust himself to do it. My clients will agree in principle to settlement discussions under the framework provided. Julia inclined her head. Good. Read distributed signature pages for interim restraints. Freeze provisions. Non-disparagement. Access surrender. Preservation of records. Daniel read each page too quickly, then doubled back, then stalled at the resignation language until Meredith said, very softly, You do not have leverage left. His signature landed jagged on the paper. Patricia signed next, lips pressed so tightly they had gone white. Charles's hand trembled once before he steadied it. When the last page was done, Julia gathered the documents into precise stacks. Businesslike. Controlled. Final. Chairs moved. Folders closed. The artificial civility of departure descended over the room, thin as tissue. Daniel stayed seated while the others rose. I stood, smoothed the front of my coat, and picked up my bag. He looked up at me with eyes that were exhausted now rather than angry. Was any of it real? The question might have sounded tragic to someone who didn't know him. To me it sounded like vanity's final instinct. Not what did I do? Not how did I become this? Just did you ever love me enough for this to hurt more cleanly? I considered him for a second. Yes, I said. That's why I learned so much. Then I turned to Patricia, who was clutching her pearls, so hard they had shifted off-center against her collarbone. The Whitmore family had a favorite phrase. They used it at fundraisers, openings, funerals, and every holiday dinner where image mattered more than grace. Protect the name. I let my eyes move from Patricia to Charles to Daniel, then back again. I did, I said, and I left them there. 6 months later, morning felt different in a way I still struggle to describe without sounding sentimental. Maybe it was the apartment. I had taken a place in Brooklyn Heights on the top floor of a limestone building with tall windows and original herringbone floors that creaked softly in winter. The kitchen was smaller than the one in the Whitmore house, but it belonged to me in a way that made every object feel brighter. White ceramic mugs, matte brass hardware, a narrow balcony with black iron railings and a view of sycamores, rooftops, and the East River flashing between buildings like spilled foil in the early sun. On the first warm morning in April, I stood out there barefoot with coffee in both hands and let the light settle over my shoulders. It came in gold, not harsh, touching the brick walls opposite and the glass towers beyond until the whole skyline looked dipped in honey. Somewhere below, a dog barked twice. A delivery truck hissed at the curb. A woman in a red coat laughed into her phone as she crossed the street. The peace of that hour wasn't dramatic. That was what made it precious. After enough chaos, the sound of your own kettle becomes a luxury. People always imagine karma as thunder. They want collapse, public scenes, mugshots, front page humiliation. Sometimes it does happen that way. More often it arrives through attrition, through doors quietly closing, through certain invitations never coming again. Daniel lost the promotion before the quarter ended. Officially, he stepped aside during an internal review. Unofficially, the board realized that making a man with active exposure for fraud and evidence fabrication the face of a hospitality group was the corporate equivalent of setting linen drapes on fire. His interim successor was brought in from outside the family, which Patricia took as a deeper insult than the investigation itself. 3 months after that, Daniel's apartment on Mercer Street disappeared from the records because he could no longer afford the lease once the company cut off reimbursement channels and the settlement stripped out his access to shared accounts. The last I heard, he was subletting a furnished place in Jersey City with a view of a parking structure and calling former vendors to discuss advisory opportunities. Patricia lost her charity chairmanship in under 8 weeks. At first the board tried to keep it discreet, a leave of absence, a scheduling issue. Then someone leaked enough detail about the Whitmore internal review that the women who sat beside Patricia at donor luncheons started answering her texts 3 days late, then not at all. There is no frost quite like social frost among rich people who pride themselves on public virtue. One gala season, and she went from being greeted at the center of the room to standing near floral installations pretending to study the place cards. Charles retired earlier than planned. He issued a measured statement about generational transition and confidence in the company's future, but people talk. They always do, especially when old kings leave suddenly and their sons do not inherit cleanly. I heard from Reed that Charles had spent most of a summer in Connecticut trying to salvage private investor relationships over lunches that ran long and ended badly. Lauren fared worst in a different way. She had always mistaken proximity to power for power itself. When the investigation forced disclosure of the vendor approvals, HR and outside counsel boxed her in so fast, she barely had time to craft a narrative. She resigned before termination, which spared her the most public wording but not the stain. Last I heard, she was trying to reposition herself as an independent brand consultant online, posting filtered photos of white orchids and saying things about resilience that made me put my phone down. As for the enablers, they scatter the way people always do once the sun hits the wrong part of the room. The family office controller, who never asked enough questions, quietly relocated to a smaller firm in Boston. Meredith Pike retained the Whitmores, but no longer handled any matter involving Daniel directly. 2 board members who used to praise his discipline now spoke about him as a cautionary tale, the way institutions cleanse themselves by turning one former favorite into a lesson. The messages came in waves. At first Daniel was furious. "You overplayed this. You've embarrassed my parents. If you had concerns, you should have come to me." Then indignant. "Sienna manipulated you. My mother was trying to protect the family. You turned a marriage into litigation." Then nostalgic, which somehow felt the most insulting. "I miss the way we used to work together. No one understands me the way you did. The family isn't the same without you." That last one arrived at 1:12 a.m. on a Thursday. I read it while standing at my kitchen sink in socks, rinsing a wineglass after dinner, and felt nothing except a kind of anthropological curiosity. I took a screenshot, added it to the archive folder Julia had told me to maintain, and blocked the newest number he'd used. Patricia tried once. Her message was longer, more polished, less direct in its desperation. Whatever happened between you and Daniel, I always believed you were strong enough to choose dignity over destruction. I stared at it for a full 10 seconds. Then I archived it beside the rest. The beautiful thing about restraint is that it starves people who feed on access. My new work began almost by accident. During the legal process, Julia started asking if I would sit in on a few early strategy meetings with clients facing internal sabotage in family-run companies. You see motives before they become events, she told me. That's rarer than people think. So I did. Then one referral became 3. 3 became 7. By autumn I had formally launched Vale and Mercer Advisory. Yes, the name raised eyebrows, and yes, I kept it anyway, with a focus on executive reputation risk, internal deception mapping, and crisis preemption for private firms and high-net-worth family structures. Not glamorous, not public-facing, not especially sentimental. Just precise work built from a skill I had acquired the hard way, learning how lies organize themselves before they detonate. Sienna and I did not become instant friends. Life is not generous enough for that kind of neatness. What we became first was useful to each other, then respectful, then gradually, something warmer and stranger. She didn't work with me full-time. That would have made for a better story than a wise business decision. But she did consult on communication architecture and disclosure strategy, and she was very, very good at it. Once you've watched a man script women against each other for his own protection, you become hard to manipulate by performance. That made both of us sharper. Julia remained in my life too, though in her case friendship looked like dinner reservations made 3 weeks in advance and text messages that said things like never trust a man who describes himself as a builder if he outsources all emotional labor. She was the one who insisted I buy the apartment. Stability, she said over Dover Sol at Le Jardin, should always have your name on the deed. It was Reed who gave me the first truly satisfying karma update. We were in my office one Tuesday afternoon, sunlight moving across the pale oak conference table, when he looked up from a spreadsheet and said almost casually, "You won't believe who I just saw in the lobby downstairs." I leaned back in my chair. Should I? Daniel. He was here for a preliminary consultation with restructuring counsel. Different floor, different matter. I took a sip of coffee. How did he look? Reed considered it. Like someone who finally understands that consequences are not a phase. I smiled into the rim of the cup. Another update came from Sienna in late October. We were having lunch at a narrow little place in Cobble Hill with bentwood chairs, tiled floors, and windows fogged from soup steam and cold air. She was halfway through telling me about a client's disastrous attempt at a preemptive apology statement when her phone lit up. She glanced at it, then raised one eyebrow. "What?" "It's from an old contact in donor relations," she said. "Patricia's winter gala sponsor just pulled." I tore off a piece of bread. "That's unfortunate." "No," Sienna said mildly. "What's unfortunate is that they cited values alignment." I laughed so hard I had to set my glass down. That was another thing nobody tells you about survival. After the worst is over, humor returns in fragments. Dry, quiet, precise, like sunlight finding the edges of a room you thought would stay dark. The friendship that surprised me most, though, wasn't with Sienna. It was with Tomas. He had driven for the Whitmores for 9 years. Weddings, airport runs, donor dinners, board retreats, the entire polished machinery of family life. He was the one who had opened the car door for me that morning after the kitchen ambush, and he was also the one who had once, months before any of this broke, looked at me in the rearview mirror after dropping Daniel at a hotel he had no reason to be visiting and said with careful neutrality, "Would you like me to keep a copy of tonight's route log, Mrs. Whitmore?" I had looked back at him then, really looked, at the professionalism, the quiet intelligence, the risk in the question. "Yes," I'd said. He never pried, never gossiped, never tried to be useful in exchange for gratitude. He simply did his job with integrity in a household where that had become almost radical. After the settlement, I hired him on retainer for my firm's client movement and secure transport needs. He accepted with a single nod and said, "I prefer working where facts matter." So no, I wasn't alone after the fire. Not at all. That winter, just before the holidays, I hosted a small dinner at my apartment. Nothing extravagant. 8 people. Good wine. Candlelight reflected softly in the window glass. A long wooden table I had bought myself, and not because it matched anyone else's expectations. Julia brought flowers. Reed brought a bottle of Burgundy, so expensive I accused him of showing off. Tomas came late because he had a client drop, then stood in my doorway holding a box of pastries from a bakery in Carroll Gardens and looking faintly uncomfortable at being thanked. Sienna arrived last in a black coat dusted with snow. For a second, seeing her there still felt improbable. Not wrong, just improbable. Like one of those narrow bridges in old European cities that look decorative until you remember they were built to carry weight. She stepped inside, unwound her scarf, and held up a bottle of champagne. "Peace offering," she said. "We're long past that," I replied. She smiled slightly. "Then call it good taste." Later that evening, when the plates were half cleared and the city outside had gone blue with winter dark, I watched laughter move around the table and realized something that would have devastated the version of me who first found that photo on the anonymous number. I had not merely survived Daniel. I had outlived the version of myself that made him possible. That realization didn't arrive as triumph. It arrived as calm. Months passed. Work expanded. Spring returned. And then one evening in early May, almost exactly a year after the first strange cracks appeared in my marriage, I found myself on the rooftop terrace of a restored hotel in Dumbo, standing beneath strings of small warm lights while the sun went down behind Lower Manhattan in a wash of orange and rose. The glass towers caught the last light and held it for a moment before releasing it to evening. The river below looked dark and metallic. Somewhere farther down the terrace, a low jazz trio was working through an old standard while people in linen and silk drifted between cocktails and conversation. I was there for a client launch. Sienna was there because she had shaped the communication rollout. At one point we both stepped away from the crowd and moved toward the edge of the terrace, where the wind came cooler off the water. She was holding a coupe glass in one hand, shoes in the other, laughing under her breath because her feet had finally lost patience with professionalism. "I used to hate events like this," she said, leaning her elbows lightly on the stone ledge. "All performance, all angles. And now I know performance can be useful if the truth is doing the driving." I looked out at the skyline. The last of the sun was settling low, turning the undersides of the clouds copper. In the building windows across the river, office lights were beginning to come on one by one, small squares of human effort floating above the streets. A year earlier, I would have thought closure needed drama. A confession, a collapse, an apology with the right wording. But standing there in the warm dusk with the city unfolding beneath us and someone beside me who had once been cast as my enemy, I understood that closure is often quieter than pain. It's a glass raised without bitterness. It's finding your shoulders have finally dropped. It's realizing the people who try to define your ending no longer narrate anything. Sienna lifted her coupe slightly toward me. To inconvenient women. I touched my glass to hers. To documentation. We both laughed. Then we drank. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The music drifted. The terrace lights glowed softly against the deepening blue. Behind us, someone opened a champagne bottle and a few people clapped. In the east, the first city lights had begun to gather like a second constellation. I thought about the woman I had been in the Whitmore house. Competent, loyal, carefully composed. So eager to make myself indispensable that I had mistaken usefulness for safety. I don't judge her now. She was not weak. She was simply still operating under the old fantasy that if she loved something well enough, it would become honest in return. The woman I became was not harder exactly, just clearer. I learned that composure is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling disciplined into direction. I learned that silence can be a weapon when chosen and a cage when inherited. I learned that some people call you cold the moment they realize you won't burn your dignity to keep them warm. Most of all, I learned that loss becomes lighter when it stops being personal and starts becoming instructional. So yes, sometimes, in the privacy of my own mind, I thank Daniel. I thank Patricia. I thank all of them. Not for the humiliation, not for the lies, for the catalyst, because they pushed me into the kind of clarity I might never have reached on my own. They mistook my steadiness for passivity, my restraint for blindness, my love for permission. And in doing that, they forced me to meet the sharpest, strongest version of myself. By the time the sun vanished completely, the sky had turned that deep velvet blue that makes every lit window look intimate. I slipped my shoes off for a second and felt the terrace stone still warm from the day. The breeze lifted a strand of hair across my cheek. Behind me, voices rose and softened and rose again. Life, continuing in all directions. I picked up my glass and took one last look at the city. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making them hurt. It's about becoming someone their damage can no longer reach. And if I've learned anything worth keeping, it's this. Sometimes the best justice isn't about destroying what broke you. It's about building a life so steady, so clear, and so fully your own that they never get to define you again.